like to turn to the book of Joshua, chapter 3. Joshua, chapter 3. The book of Joshua is a book about spiritual conquest and occupation. It's a book that teaches the reality of spiritual victory and how to obtain such. It's a book of new beginnings for the people of God. It's in the book of Joshua that after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, that Israel claims their inheritance, enjoys the blessings of the land that God had prepared for them. I'd like to read verses 1 through 5. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and they removed from Shittim and came to Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. And it came to pass after 3 days that the officers went through the host, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then ye shall remove from your place and go after it. And there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits, about 3,000 feet, by measure. Come not near unto it, that ye may know the way by which ye must go. For ye have not passed this way heretofore. And Joshua said unto the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Israel is on the verge of possessing the land that God promised them. It's right there on the other side of the Jordan River. So in between them and the promised land is the Jordan River. Canaan is right there. The Jordan River established the entry point in the promised land of Canaan. Concerning this land, we hear God say in Leviticus 20, verse 24, I will give it unto you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. In Numbers 33:53, for I have given you the land to possess it. And it is described in Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 and 11, as a place of great and goodly cities, which thou buildest not. That's grace. And houses full of good things, which thou fillest not, and wells digged, which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees, which thou plantest not. In other words, it is a land of God's grace. And in Deuteronomy 11, verse 21, it is described by the words, heaven upon the earth. So this promised land of Canaan for the child of God today is a picture of the possession and the enjoyment of God's best in earthly life. A picture of a higher plane of spiritual living. A picture of fellowship with God, walking with God, having daily communion with God. Simply enjoying God, enjoying the blessings of God. For us that are saved, Canaan represents the spiritually abundant life. A life of flourishing spiritually. Living life in the peace and the joy, the power and the glory of the Lord. The best possible life that a child of God can live upon this earth. That's what Canaan pictures. And over, Israel is reminded of the opportunity and of their responsibility toward this promised land. We read in Deuteronomy 1 verse 8, "Behold, the Lord thy God hath set the land before thee." It's right there. Go. Go in and possess the land. And I believe that's what God says to each one of us. It's right before us. The life, the best life that we can have upon this earth. Go. Go in and possess it. Deuteronomy 1:21, "Behold, the Lord thy God hath set the land before thee. Go up and possess it." 31 times in the book of Deuteronomy, possessing the promised land is mentioned. 31 times they are told, go, possess the land. The spiritual, abundant life that Canaan represents is ours to possess. It's right there. But oh, how often we fail to possess and enjoy what God has for us. Coming to our text, right before the Israelites was spiritual abundance. On the other side of the Jordan River, there was more. There was God's best for them. And in our text, they are instructed to take further steps into the blessings of God. And that is our subject. Further steps to blessing. Again, behold, the Lord thy God hath set the land before thee. So the life of enjoying the blessings of salvation is right before us. Yet many stand on the edge of the Jordan River, looking over into Canaan, never really enjoying, never really entering even the border of that land. But in our text, we have God's instruction. And that instruction is still for today. So let's look first of all at Israel before the Jordan River. We know that when the nation of Israel miraculously left Egypt on the night of the Passover, they no doubt did so with a sense of triumph, tremendous relief. For generations, they had served as slaves, suffering severe persecution. Pharaoh had imposed a severe regiment upon them. They were to build cities for Egypt with very, very little resources. And year after year, the Israelites felt the crushing impact of being strangers in a foreign land, slaves to a foreign power. But all of that dramatically changed when God delivered them by the blood of the Lamb. When that Passover night was to be a never forgotten experience. So it is with you and I, with salvation. And with it, with that deliverance, with the blood of the Lamb, came the hopes and the dreams and the ambitions of a new life. Life was to now be different. Now, most commentators suggest well over 2 million people coming out of Egypt, and that very well could be. It's not hard to imagine that. But they're looking forward. to a new land, a new life, living a different kind of life. An expectation and excitement fills their hearts. But though they had been delivered, and God was leading them toward the promised land, instead of trusting Him and obeying Him, they fall into rebellion. And instead of accepting the Word of God, the providence of God, the precepts of God, they fight against them. So much so that a generation passed without ever entering the promised land. And for the next 40 years, they wandered about the desert with no real joy, no real stability, no real security. 40 years of going in circles. And now, new generation, they come to the Jordan River. And there's a simple sentence in verse 15 that gives us the picture. For Jordan overfloweth all his banks all the time of harvest. And that was the time. So on the other side of Jordan is where they can enter into the promised land. But at this time, the Jordan was defiantly impassable. Could not be crossed. That usual gentle river is now a raging river, swelled to flood stage. And there they are. He said that at this time, it is said that at this time the currents could reach up to 40 miles an hour. And the question is asked in Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 5. How wilt thou do in the swelling of Jordan? Talking about this time right here in Joshua 3 when the Jordan River is flooded. And beside the river being flooded, the plain that surrounds that river was basically a mass of tangled brush. Very dense growth. So here's the scene. The Jordan River, which is only about 100 feet wide at Gilgal, where they would be crossing, has swelled its banks to an impassable width of probably over a mile across, ranging in depth from 3 to 12 feet, they say, at flood stage. Again, covering, having passed beyond its banks, covering all the undergrowth, which could easily trip someone up, causing them to fall and be caught in the current. So this was the sight that greets this multitude. We're told in our text, verses 1 and 2, that they lodged there for 3 days. For 3 days, they can see the flooded Jordan River. For 3 days, they could hear the rushing of that water. So we picture them, they're very anxious. They have a desire to enter that land that they have been promised. But for 3 days, they are brought face to face with an insurmountable problem. They get up, day 2, the problem's still there. All through the day, they get up the 3rd day, problem is still there. Face to face with an insurmountable problem, an insurmountable difficulty, an obstacle that could not be overcome. And again, I'm sure that the sound of that river eroded all their confidence, pounded the reality into them We can't pass over. We cannot cross this river into the land. You can almost picture them sitting around their fires at night, talking. Someone may say, well, maybe the strong among us can brave the waters and get across. But what about the infants? What about the children? What about those that are sickly? Not to mention all of our possessions strapped to wagons. There are two leaders, Moses and Aaron. They've passed on. And now a young man by the name of Joshua has been put in charge. And if they're ever going to get to Canaan, they have to cross over what is now an insurmountable river. So here are these Israelites camped along the Jordan River, right on the edge of the Promised Land. And they are faced with this problem, this difficulty, this obstacle. And I'm sure that there were many proposals offered on how to get across. Some might just say, well, let's just go back. It's obvious we can't get across. Let's just go back. Some might walk down river a little way and say, hey, it's not quite as bad down here as it is over there. Maybe we can cross here. Others might say, well, let's just stay here and wait. No doubt, for 3 days, they examined various ways of getting across that river. For 3 days, they sized up the problem. And as they did, they became increasingly aware that crossing the Jordan River was impossible. It would mean death for many. The Lord not only brought the Israelites face to face with the swollen and raging Jordan River, but face to face with the fact that they had no means of crossing that river. God has brought them to the end of themselves, the end of their resources. They have no way in and of themselves to successfully get across that river. So they must either cross or go back and settle for just being short of what God has promised them. And I believe God's people do that every day. They settle for just being short of the life that God has for them. Now the question could be asked, could not God have brought them to this Jordan at a different time when it wasn't so difficult? Well, yes, He most certainly could. But He didn't. But He didn't. And He tells them, now's the time. Now's the time to cross this river. So there they are before the Jordan River. You and I are to be constantly advancing toward a higher plane of spiritual living, to a greater experience of the things of God, advancing more and more into the enjoyment of the Lord, living a spiritual, abundant life. But just like the Jordan River, there are things, there are people that get in the way. Problems, difficulties, obstacles that stand between us and the further blessings of God. These Jordan rivers can be literal, very real, and we can imagine them. But in either case, whether literal or imagined, they're real. They're real. These Jordan rivers can be placed before us by the hand of God. They can be placed before us by Satan. They can be placed before us by others. And they can even be self-made. But no matter what the source, they're real. They're real. And they are intimidating, but they've got to be crossed. Doesn't matter where they come from. You got to get across them. So the Jordan rivers that we encounter, notice, if we turn there, Joshua 1 verse 11. Notice some important words. The first one is prepare. This is the instruction that the leaders were to give to the people. Prepare. The next words that I want to notice is Passover. And the third is possess. Prepare, Passover, possess. To prepare is to be in journeying order. To be ready. To be ready. Most of God's people are not ready. They're not in journeying order. Prepare. And then the next thing is Passover. You don't want to do that before you're prepared. Prepare, Passover. That is, move forward in spite of the obstacle. And then thirdly, possess. Obtain what God has for you. And there are times in our life that are crossover times. It's time to cross over. It's time to cross over. Personal Jordans can feel permanent. They can be powerful, so powerful that we don't even attempt to make it across. So when brought face to face with these Jordans, How do we proceed? How do we proceed from there? What must we do? How do we face those rivers? Well, our text provides the answer and the instruction for those times. So we want to look at God's instruction. So there are the Israelites before this impassable Jordan River. God told them in verse 4 of Joshua 3, "Ye have not passed this way heretofore." God's brought them a different way. It's an unknown way. It's a mysterious way. Ye have not passed this way heretofore. It's a new experience, a new endeavor. And because of human nature, with every new thing, there is a certain amount of apprehension, a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of doubt, a certain amount of concern about what is ahead. And there they are. No doubt, apprehensive, fearful, doubting people, face to face with an insurmountable obstacle. How are they to proceed? Again, our text provides the answer. God tells them exactly how He wanted things to be done. And I believe God still does that. The problem is we don't want to hear it many times. God says you can get across, and here's how. And it's the only way. And Joshua then instructed the officers who went through the congregation of the people, instructing them. So if you and I are ever going to cross over the Jordans that arise in our lives, we must listen to God's instruction and do it God's way. So many times we go, I tried, and I failed every time. That's because you didn't do it God's way. You do it God's way, you will not fail. As long as we insist upon it doing it our way, we'll never cross over. Never will. So what is God's instruction? Well, it's implied throughout. Submit to God. Submit to God. God was in control of every single detail. You know, God's people say all that. Well, God knows all about it. Then why don't you submit to Him? If you really believe that. God was in control of every single detail. He always is. Never a time when He isn't. And in order for them to go on with God and to enjoy the blessing of God, they have to yield to Him. That's just common sense. This is the force of the words in verse 3. And they commanded the people, saying, When ye see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then shall you move from your place and go after it. Yield to these instructions. The direction of verse 3 centers upon the ark of the covenant. An extraordinary piece of tabernacle furniture. A golden chest with twin cherubims above the mercy seat. A symbol of God's presence all through the Old Testament. It is a symbol of God's presence. And there they are on this part of the journey with an impassable Jordan River before them. And God is reminding them by way of the Ark of the Covenant, you do not go alone. You do not go alone. The direction of verse 3 is that they were not to approach the obstacle in their life by themselves. They were to follow the Ark of the Covenant that would go before them, the presence of God. So they were to go as they were led, submit to God. And notice, God had a particular order how they were to proceed. Notice verse 3, 2 words. And they commanded the people, saying, here's the first word, when? When? Ye see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites bearing it, here's the second word, then. When? Then. Those are words that indicate order. It has to be done in this order. When? Then. God is a God of order. Always is. Submit to God's order. Submit to God's order without any questions, without any argument. You submit to God's order. That's how you get across. Secondly, the second part of the instruction is focus upon God. Again, verse 3. When ye see, notice those 2 words, ye see. When ye see the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Again, that ark represents the presence of God with His people. So with the intimidating Jordan River before them, the further blessings of God on the other side of that river, they must see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God. This is a recognition of God's presence with them. Submit to God. Recognize God's presence with you. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they're to feel the reality of God's presence with them. And then in verse 4, further instruction is given concerning this ark of the covenant. And this instruction would enable them to focus upon the ark of the covenant or the presence of God. He's saying you stay 2,000 cubits behind the ark. A cubit's about 18 inches. So that'd be 3,000 feet. You stay behind the ark of the covenant. You do not go before. You stay behind so you can see it. So you can see it. So this would enable them to focus. Nothing else was to fill their vision. What you read there in verse 4, God is basically saying, look at the ark. Look at the ark. Don't look at the river. Look at the ark. The presence of God. They are to look at it with a steady eye, with a fixed eye, with a very intent eye. And this would assure them. They could see it. It assures them of the presence of God. So what he's telling them in verse 4 is you put yourself in a position to see the presence of God every step of the way. You put yourself in a position to see the presence of God. He's calling upon them to maintain a position where they could see the presence of God. He's telling them, don't lose sight of me. Don't lose sight of that ark. So our instruction is, submit to God's order, focusing upon the one who is over all and who is able. And then notice what it says in verse 4. That ye may know. You keep your eye on that ark. That ye may know the way by which ye must go. In other words, you can't just go off any way you please. There is a way you must go if you're going to get across this Jordan. And the way to know that way is to stay focused upon the presence of God. So, with the intimidating, impassable Jordan River between them and the further blessings of God, with an apparent impossibility between them and the further blessings of God, there was a way, and there always is. There was a way, and they could know the way. But they're not going to know the way by taking a survey amongst the people and asking everyone else what they should do. They're to know the way by keeping their eye upon that ark, the presence of God. The third instruction, follow. Notice verse 3. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that is, with that assurance of the presence of God, remove from your place. You don't remove until then. When you see, remove from your place and go after it. And go after it. That is, pursue God. Keep your eyes on God. Pursue God. There was no reason for them to follow their own reasoning. There's no reason for you and I to follow our own reasoning. And the reason is because God was going to make the way. God was going to make a path through their obstacle. You don't have to make the path. Quit trying to make the path. God will make the path. You submit to Him. You focus upon Him. You follow Him. You don't make the road. That's God's doing. And that's the problem today. People want to make their own way. But your way doesn't work. It never will. You follow God. The way through Jordan is follow God. That may not be the easiest thing you'll ever do, but it'll be the best thing that you can do. It's not necessarily easy to follow God, but it is the best thing. Be sure of that. Fourth, there must be a stepping out. Notice again, verse 3. Remove from your place and go after it. Again, remember, when and then. When those two things are accomplished, remove from your place. Leave where you are and go after it. So there is a purpose in their going. Notice the last phrase of verse 8. When ye are come to the brink of the water of Jordan, ye shall stand still in Jordan. This was to the priests. They were to come to the brink of the water. And this would also be so of every Israelite. Seeing and knowing the presence of God, they were to step out. They were to step out. Each step bringing them closer to the brink of the raging river. Seeing the ark of the covenant of the Lord would give them the courage to step out. It would also make them willing to step out. Step by step, toward the further blessings of God. That should be our life. Step by step toward the further blessings of God. Step by step toward a higher plane of spiritual living. Fifthly, there was instruction of personal consecration, verse 5. Sanctify yourselves. Set yourselves apart. You have this instruction. Now set yourself apart to follow the instruction, which gets back to submit to God. Setting yourself apart to God. That includes a lot of things. It includes putting away sin. It includes putting everything that stands between us and God away. It is being in a right condition to do everything that God has said. Be in the right, you have God's instruction. Now you have to be in a condition to follow that instruction. A lot of people aren't there. Yeah, I know what God says, but. Okay, there it is. There it is. You know what the instructions are, but you're not in a condition to follow it. And that's what Joshua is saying here, sanctify. He's saying these instructions are not easy. You need to set yourself apart. And then he tells them, expect great things. And Joshua said unto the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. There's the impassable river. But notice 3 words. The Lord will. The Lord will. Notice 4 words. The Lord will do. The Lord will. The Lord will do. In other words, the Lord is going to. It is the Lord will do wonders. The miraculous. The Lord will do what you cannot do. He will do the miraculous among you. It is a reminder that God can. It is a reminder that God is able. God opened a path through the waters for His people. A reminder that God can clear the way. God can clear the way. Step out with God and expect God to do what only God can do. You follow God's instructions. You follow God's instructions to a T. You have every reason to expect God to do what only He can do. But you have to follow His instructions. So in closing, there are, always are, the further blessings of God. There is a higher plane of spirituality. And we're often faced with new situations, circumstances, problems, obstacles. And the mind may be overflowed with questions. How do we proceed? And the answer is found in our text. The first thing you need to do is submit to God. God had directions for His people. And those directions amounted to further steps into the blessings of God. You see, the lives of God's people do not have to be stalled and stuck on the wrong side of God's promises and God's best for us. There are directions to avoid that. And it's by these directions that we avoid spiritual shipwreck. These directions are how we avoid going the wrong way, heading in the wrong direction. You follow God's directions to a T, you won't go in the wrong direction. You won't make any wrong turns. We only do that when we get our eyes off God and we cease to follow His directions. And oh, how many of God's people hear and they read about the abundant life, but they never make it out of the wilderness. They never do. There will always be Jordan rivers between us and the further blessings of God, between us and a higher plane of spiritual living. And these rivers must be overcome. And God is the way. God is the way. Well, so-and-so experienced the same thing and they did it this way. That really doesn't matter. God is the way. Why are we so adverse to just doing it God's way? What makes people think that they have a better way? You don't. And no one else does. God's way is the best way. Just do it God's way. And you will experience wonders. You will experience the miraculous. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us